question.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to share this book along today. The book entitled Diaspora Engagement in Times of Severe Economic Crisis in Greece and Beyond, edited by Othon Anastasakis, Manolis Pratsinakis, myself, and Antony, is an important milestone for the Greek diaspora project at CISOS. The Greek diaspora project, as many of you in this room know, has been focusing for almost 5 years now on several aspects of homeland diaspora nexus. In doing so, it has also built strong relationships and partnerships with several other institutions in Greece and across the world, enhancing, in a sense, the transnational space of Hellenism, and hence, of course, being a product of its time. The assumption of our analytical work is based upon the fact that economic crisis has reconfigured diaspora and homeland ties. Through multi-level analysis and through interdisciplinary lenses and in comparative contexts, we have proved in our work, and also it is depicted in our book, that crisis can challenge the resilience of earlier patterns of engagement. Also, the crisis can play a significant role to the emergence of new spaces of engagement between the homeland and the diaspora. And, of course, to the emergence of new actors in the Greek transnational diasporic terrain. During this time, we've worked on political, social, philanthropic axis of the Greek diaspora. And more specifically, we produced a survey on Greeks in the UK, shedding light on several political, social, and economic characteristics of their engagement with the homeland. We've also built the Greek diaspora map, Greek digital map, now including more than 4,000 diasporic organizations and associations. It constitutes a dynamic tool that can be used in different ways to depict and connect Hellenism across the world. We've produced reports on the impacts of diaspora and transnational philanthropy during the economic crisis, and also published an e-book on the diaspora and homeland in the time of pandemic. This is composed of contributions evaluating the coronavirus pandemic affecting new terms of interaction between the diaspora and the homeland. We've carried out research to analyze the diasporic Greek votes, focusing on the 2019 adoption of the facilitation of the diasporic votes abroad, which constituted a pivotal moment in the political engagement of the Greek diaspora within the homeland. Through brainstorming meetings, expert workshops, surveys, research, publications, reports, conferences, our digital map course, we produced sound analytical work with policy relevance, having a clearer understanding now of diaspora's role and providing a method of study for other comparative cases. Now, our current focus and next steps includes diaspora startup entrepreneurship, research and surveys for the Greeks in Germany and the US. And of course, we're going to utilize our map for analytical and connectivity purposes. Now, I would like to give the floor to our panelists who will give us a taste of some of the subjects of our book. Often we'll give an overview of the main themes of the book, focusing on crisis as critical junctures for change in the diaspora engagement components. Manolis, who will join online, will speak comparatively about new migration as a result of the crisis, looking at the South European experience, and will make specific references also to the Greek case in particular. Irina will focus on the Ukrainian experience and explaining how the Euromaidan moment affected Ukrainian diaspora engagement. And finally, Maria will act as a discussant by building on the points that will have been raised in the discussion and may want to raise some questions to the panelists. So 10 minutes for each of our panelists, and then we will proceed to the Q&A session. We will take questions from the audience present here in the room and for our audience online. And for our audience online, you can write your question and in the Q&A section in the Zoom, and then you can turn on your microphone and pose a question to the panelists. I would like to say just a few words about the bios of our panelists. Othon Anastasakis is the Director of European Studies Centre and Southeast European Studies at Oxford, Senior Research Fellow at St. Antony's College, and of course the Director of our Greek Diaspora Project. Irina Lapshyna is a lecturer at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv and research associates in our Greek diaspora program. Maria Koinova is a professor of international relations at the Politics International Studies Department at the University of Warwick and an associate senior fellow at the Center for Global Cooperation Research at the University of Duisburg in Germany. And our Manolis Pratsinakis is assistant professor in social geography at Harokopio University in Athens and research affiliate at the Center of Migration Policy and Society, COMPAS at the University of Oxford, and of course, research associates with the Greek Diaspora Project. So if you would like also to start, give us an overview of
thank you very much, Foteini. Just to say thank you for coming to this. And then this book has been the labor of 3 years, 4 years of work. So we're very proud of it because there's a lot of information in there. And it's one of the innovative books we would like to believe. Now, I would like to work a little bit around the concepts and the idea of the book before I hand over to Manolis to continue with the presentation, and then Irina. Slide, please. Looking a little bit at the concepts, I mean, the central question in our book is how severe economic crisis, which we were thinking of the Greek case, but it was other cases as well in Europe, can be critical junctures and affect patterns of diasporic engagement with homeland. So how do crises really affect that kind of relationships? And when we look at the diasporas and how we define them, I was constantly questioned that we received, how do we define them? Diasporas obviously are not simply, the historically imagined and often romantic communities that live abroad, but they can be actually change from a more pragmatic perspective and can have an impact at many levels. For our purposes, we adopted Brubaker's approach that treats diasporas as a category of practice. So in this perspective, then, we were invited to explore how the notion of diaspora is used to make claims, to articulate projects, to formulate expectations, and to mobilize energy and to appeal to loyalties. We also understand diasporas as transnational actors who are engaged with both the country of their origin, but at the same time, the country where they live and potentially integrate. Now, crises, as we know, are important cut-off historical points, which when severe, they are a break with the status quo, and they do require immediate solutions. So we adopt in our approach the social movements theory to diasporas, highlighting the critical role of events in shaping diasporic communities and driving diasporic actions. Sorry for this. Everything's connected here. Critical junctures is a notion derived from historical institutionalism, emphasizes the lasting impact of choices made during the exceptional periods and can have transformative potential with a lasting legacy. Slide, please. Now, the Greek crisis, as we all know, these are some of the figures we've told and retold, has been the sharpest in the history of Greece since the 1930s, massive decline in GDP, unemployment, debt, and severe austerity. All that with massive political, social, and economic repercussions, just to remind you a little bit what we were discussing during the last decade. Next slide, please. More specifically, the aim of our book was to answer to particular questions there. First of all, to what extent and in which areas was the crisis a cutoff point and the catalyst for different modes of engagement? What types of engagement we identify and how do these differ from the pre-crisis ones? During the crisis, did the crisis result in missed opportunities or even disengagement between homeland and diasporic actors? And finally, was Greece an exceptional case or whether it's generalizable? We wanted it to be generalizable. That's why I included the section on Portugal, Ireland, and Ukraine. At the start of the project exploration, we assumed that this particular crisis, a rupture with many past political, economic, and social practices in the Greek homeland, would unavoidably have an impact on the homeland's relationship. So on the one hand, we expected entrepreneurial and politically progressive economic force, diaspora, as giving a voice in favor of post-crisis enlightenment that Greece needed at the moment. That's why I related very much to the notion of reform. And at the same time, of course, we knew that there is not one, but many diasporas around the world with their own political agendas, their own levels of attachment to Greece, and whose attitudes to the crisis would range from indifference or apathy to activism and commitment. They are there, not the previous one. So we did deal with the notions of reform, new migration. Manolis will be talking a little bit more about it, diaspora institutions. Foteini and I worked on that from a research perspective, and then looking also at identities, attitudes, and mobilization, and beyond the Greek case, as I said before. Next slide, please. The themes of the case studies that we looked were the political engagement, new migration and human drain, the philanthropic giving. We did survey work, Greeks in the UK, the associations and organizations, how they function, public diplomacy, and economic relations. Now, all this is part of the book. And through our research in those selected areas, we tried to see what kind of patterns we noticed. And as Foteini just said before, there were two mainly kind of patterns that we saw. One of them was a rupture with past practices, and the other one was the creation of new spaces of interaction. Let me give you some examples of the rupture with past crises. Now, first of all, the crisis led, because of the high unemployment, it led to a massive exodus of Greeks and other, non-Greeks as well from Greece, adding to previous outflows of diasporic generations. In our surveys, Greeks abroad, we noted that many were actually disappointed with structural deficiencies of the system. Were looking for better opportunities at home. So it wasn't just about those who were looking for work because they couldn't find any in Greece, but also because they were not happy with the system. Trust in the system was particularly important in the surveys that we did. We also witnessed that the financial crisis affected many of the institutions. And that was a very interesting observation because these were diasporic institutions. And indeed, Greece was one of the countries that had, or among the first countries to create an institutional environment to connect with these diasporic communities. So what we saw during the crisis, for instance, there were consulates that were suffering from lack of funds. They could not cater for educational needs, for the language. They could not even cater for people who were going for paperwork in their own consulates. They were selling their assets, in order to gain money. But most interesting was the case of this Council of Hellenes Abroad, which was supposed to be an organization that brings together different diasporic actors, their representatives rather, and started with very ambitious goals. But during the crisis, it totally fell into irrelevance. Now, these are the old patterns that kind of could not continue to exist. There were problems in terms of clientelism and in terms of where the funds went with this organization. Crisis came, kind of makes that completely irrelevant. In addition, other traditional actors also had to re-identify their own role. For instance, the church, which is a pillar in many, especially the Greek American communities, is a pillar of connection between them. The Greek American mobilizational patterns were also very different in the sense that during previous crises, either during the Civil War or afterwards, they would always mobilize. In this particular case, they didn't particularly, contribute, looking at, the financial mess that Greece was. Interesting that many traditional associations as well started to become not very relevant. And even in the field of remittances, Manolis did work on that, we see a drop of remittances as well. In many cases, actually those who left, they were supported, by them, by their families at home. Now, what are the new spaces of interaction? Please. First of all, that is where Foteini and I worked. It was the facilitation of diasporic vote abroad. So while that right was guaranteed for all those who were Greek citizens, they were not able to vote if they were abroad. They had to travel back to Greece in order to be able to do so. That was something that changed because of the crisis, very much the immediate effect of the crisis. And it had to do with the fact that all this lively kind of part of Greek society, the dynamic part left abroad, they took their voting together, so which they wanted to use. That was something that became a real pressure. Another important space of new action was transnational diaspora philanthropy, in the sense that it became much more professional, more transparent in terms of civil society actors within Greece, a sector which was traditionally tied to the Greek state, but became more autonomous during the years of crisis. Also, other networks, other diasporic networks, which were related to economic action. These were entrepreneurs, the startups, for instance, and the new attitude toward business and innovation, with the introduction of high-tech technologies, that also helped a lot. That was a very important impact as well, plus new export activities that were introduced in the Greek space, connected with diasporas abroad. Finally, the technological advances helped with the social media, of course, created again new spaces of interaction between them. Instead of the old traditional associations, there was a much different kind of creation of virtual communities that would reveal their diasporic preferences and their intentions. The wider geographical and geopolitical perspective opened up new new routes actually for Greeks to go abroad. And while the traditional destinations remain the most dominant one, there were new destinations as well added in the list of going. Central and East European countries became popular destinations, especially the Czech Republic. Businesses that moved to Bulgaria, Romania, or Albania, but also further afield in Asia, Qatar, or Saudi Arabia, Singapore became kind of new destinations and new spaces. Slide, please. My final point is how do we understand the post-crisis mode of engagement between diaspora and homeland, if such a thing exists. We have some observations from our work. The issue of polycentrism and decentering the state is particularly important because we see the significance of the Greek state that had been a point of reference before in the relationship between homeland and diaspora. It becomes one of the actors now in a more polycentric kind of system. And that's good because you really don't want to have the dependency, and it wasn't working, to an extent. Of course, there are still diasporic populations that want the Greek state to become more active in terms of spreading their language or the culture. Diasporic engagement becomes more pragmatic, and we understand, in the sense that there is a need for mapping and understanding the diasporic needs, the aspiration, and the resources, and that is also very important from the light and empowering the diaspora, and at the same time, the younger generations that are using the new technologies and the new social media and all that. Of course, since then, we've had the impact of consecutive crises, and there has been different behaviors in terms of how that engagement developed during Brexit, in the sense that Greeks continued to travel after the referendum. But during Brexit, there were many that returned actually to Greece because they felt that they were much more vulnerable. How Russia and the invasion in Ukraine also affects the way that geopolitical issues are being understood. Interesting example is that the Greeks and the Jews in the United States, they are actually pulling their resources together in terms of lobbying and issues of security and high policies, forced migration. All that really affected, and we've got another series of crises that affect that kind of engagement. The new issues coming into the fore. So I will stop with that because then there's a question, of course, of generalizability and how we compare with other countries, which Manolis and Irina will be talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll move on to Manolis, who will give us his views.
Thank you very much, Foteini. Can you hear me well enough?
Yes, very well.
Excellent. So it's indeed a pleasure to be joining you, my esteemed co-panelists today. And I know that there are many known and familiar people in attendance today, and I'm very glad of that on the occasion of the publication of our book. It feels a bit strange, I have to say, not only because I'm joining you virtually, but also because this is the first time in 5 years that I'm participating in a CSOX event as an external this time. So what I'm planning to do in the next 10 minutes or so is focus on Greece, which has been the prime focus of our book, but also contextualize it within the south of Europe and look at how the economic crisis has shaped increased emigration from that region in recent years, and what the impact has been for diaspora-homeland relations. And I would like to start by sharing a graph with you. Let me see if I can do that easily. Can you see the graph?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So in fact, as Othon mentioned before, the effects of recession, austerity, combined with a rather generalized mistrust and disillusionment towards Greece's institution, the political system, more generally, along with considerable impoverishment of a segment of Greek society, explain the steep increase of emigration that we see in this graph. Starting in 2010, when the first bailout memorandum with the EU was signed, emigration peaks in 2012, decreases only modestly, and then stabilizes at around 50,000 Greek citizens emigrating annually up until at least 2020, when there was the restrictions that imposed due to the coronavirus pandemic. This issue of emigration from Greece has figured quite prominently in domestic political debates, but also attracted considerable international attention, I would say, particularly in relation to the number of highly skilled migrants who were leaving the country during this period. And indeed, 2 out of 3 of those who left during the crisis have been people with tertiary education, thus raising concerns about the long-term developmental prospects of a country that is being increasingly deprived of its young, educated workforce. But having said that, highly skilled emigration from Greece was not a new phenomenon. There has been a continuous outflow of professionals, even though modest in size throughout recent decades, particularly after the 1990s. And this has been mostly due to structural weaknesses of the Greek economy, which has failed to successfully move from a low-cost to a high-value economy. And as a result, the rapid expansion of tertiary education that took place during the 1980s was not matched by a corresponding increase in demand for high-skilled jobs in the public and private sector. And as a result, there has been, before the outbreak of the economic crisis, already emigration of highly skilled young Greeks for better career prospects. But what changed critically is what we saw in the graph, namely the volume of migration that dramatically increased with job opportunities in the private sector shrinking and public sector employment practically being no longer an option due to cuts and restrictions. So Greece's brain drain should therefore not be seen as a direct result of the crisis, but rather as a continuation of an earlier trend and whose structural preconditions predate the crisis. And those structural preconditions are in fact shared by other countries across Southern Europe, particularly Italy, and largely relate to unfavorable labor market conditions. I don't know why my camera blurred. I hope it will fix itself. So Greece and Italy consistently have had the lowest employment rates for young, highly skilled people in the European Union, with Portugal and Spain also being well below the EU average. And these low employment rates are in fact not due to oversupply of educated people or overeducation, given that the share of people with university degrees in Greece and Portugal is around the European mean. In Spain is a little bit above, but not too much. And in fact, in Italy, Italy has the second lowest share in the EU. So the reason, in fact, can be found in the lack of demand, meaning a labor market that is failing to absorb its educated workforce. And at the same time, equally important, nepotism, gerontocracy, and hierarchical working arrangements, increasingly also low salaries, especially in relation to the cost of life, all of this being common in South European countries, which either hamper employment access for many or negatively impact the working experiences for those who do manage to secure jobs that match their skills. But the economic crisis did not only fed, maybe here what I should say though, and here I can also, I can share my screen once more for another graph, which I think is telling. Yeah, so because it needs to be said that the eurozone debt crisis exacerbated labor market conditions and resulted in increased immigration in all countries in Southern Europe. But as we can see in this graph here, the increase was much more pronounced in Portugal and Greece, and particularly Greece. So indeed, immigration rates in Spain and Italy doubled, but they in fact remain still below the EU average. Just to clarify, this graph shows the rates, not the absolute numbers. Obviously, in terms of absolute numbers, the majority of immigrants come from Spain and Italy, both being much larger countries than Greece and Portugal. Right. So one thing has been the increase in volume. The second thing has been the change also in the motivational factors driving people to leave. And prior to the crisis, it has been primarily people who saw their immigration as a positive career move, expected to be followed by an eventual return. By contrast, after 2010, those people, especially who left Greece, did so due to a deep-felt disappointment with the sociopolitical and economic conditions in the country, and from what they perceived to be a rather depressing lack of prospects in that country. And it could be said that irrespective of skills, education, and age, the majority were planning and still plan a longer stay abroad, aimed for a more predictable life and aimed to get ahead and materialize their aspirations. And that's common more or less in all four countries. And we can, in fact, identify three different types of immigrant profiles, I would say. On the one hand, it is a small minority of career-oriented immigrants whose motivations highlight a continuation of pre-crisis migration patterns. On the other hand, it is the crisis-driven immigrants for whom the crisis and the circumstances it brought to their lives shaped abrupt, migration decisions. And this group was overrepresented among the Greeks. But for all four nationals, the majority somehow falls somewhere in between. And for them, the crisis may not have had a direct impact in shaping their decision to leave, but was really critically important in reshaping the wider socioeconomic dynamics that triggered their decision to do so. During the crisis, immigration began to be popularly framed as a way to achieve a better life. Media painted a rather positive image of it. Many people, especially the younger generations, became much more open to take the risk of emigrating to avoid socioeconomic stagnation. Parents, older generations became much more encouraging towards such decisions. And it could be said that there was a change of everyday discourse about emigration and concomitant loosening up of social constraints against moving far from home, making migration a much more widely considered and practiced option, which explains also why immigration tends to continue after, still. And the third point with that I would conclude is the following. Besides the changes in volume and the motivations that drives immigration during this period, I think that immigration itself had a considerable impact on diaspora-homeland relations, and this was made in three distinct ways, I think, no, interlinked and somehow different ways. So firstly, it was the demographic change, obviously. The second, it was the change of the kind of diasporic activism that was embraced by those new communities. And thirdly, it was the politicization of emigration that kind of led towards reconsidering of diaspora engagement policies and models. About the diasporic change, the communities that shaped in Europe of those 4 countries, and I'm saying Europe because the majority headed to European destinations, notably UK, in fact. Here it needs to be noted that for all South Europeans in the UK, their population quadrupled within a time span of only 10 years. So in the UK, and but also other countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Sweden, the demographic makeup of local diasporas increased, but also changed in the makeup in terms of becoming younger and comprised by a significant number of more highly educated individuals. And the second point, which relates to that, has to do with the fact that the increased number of emigrants not only rejuvenated local diasporic communities in numbers, but also changed the character of their diasporic activism. Focusing on the Greek case here, new associations formed in order to cater for the needs of the new migrants that were different from those of the established diasporic communities. Networks of volunteers organized to offer help to newcomers. There was political organization to protest jointly against the punitive austerity imposed to Greece, and possibly more central to what we're discussing today here with reference to the book, also to offer help to Greeks and Greece to at some points also to help refugees and solidarity networks supporting them at the peak of the so-called refugee crisis. Offer mentorship, know-how to help address the root causes of the crisis by some groups that have had this interest, and as well as has been noted already by Othon, making demands towards the state and protesting against certain policies. And the impact of such voice was one of the main reasons why, for instance, during this period, the facilitation of the vote in national elections from abroad was made possible. And the third and last point...
If you could wrap up the presentation.
Yeah, that's the last point. Yeah, thank you. The last point, with that I'm concluding, and sorry if I took more than I should have had, is the politicization of immigration. That was something that took place in all 4 countries. Immigration came to symbolize, for instance, in Greece, the economic and political downfall of the country and indicate its grim prospects for the future. And a discourse emerged in which so-called brain gain generation was deemed sine qua non for Greece's regeneration. And thus that entailed opening up a discussion about the root causes of this phenomenon, and also opening a discussion on what are the best ways to connect with each diaspora beyond and besides older models that aim to sustain the cultural ties of Greeks abroad. And new discussions opened up about how to develop a sustained transnational ties of Greeks abroad, also in relation to brain circulation and potentially brain gain in the future. And here I would like to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manolis. And we move on to Irina to give us about the Ukrainian case.
Thank you, Pratsinakis. First of all, I would like to thank you, Othon and Foteini and Manolis and the whole wonderful Greek team, first for working with them on the Greek diaspora project and then contributing to the book about the diasporas. And it's been a big pleasure for me always, especially when I got our book first, I think, because I was based in Germany and somehow our book arrived first to me. So I saw our joint product first. And today I would like to present my chapter, which was about migration and diaspora at times of crisis. public perception of immigrants in Ukraine. So in my chapter, I examine the national discourse on migration and diaspora in times of crisis. And the Euromaidan 2013-2014, I frame as a threshold event, as a political crisis that triggered consequent economic crisis, and therefore I call it as a crisis complex. And first, I would like to start with the pre-Euromaidan migration discourse, and I dive in here in Soviet heritage that was extremely interesting to me. I also wanted to understand where from this extremely negative media discourse and public discourse in Ukraine we have about immigrant diaspora. Later on, I moved to the Euromaidan revolution and the Ukrainian crisis complex as a threshold event. I looked at the diaspora engagement in 2 case studies. I've conducted interviews in the UK and in Poland with the diaspora representatives, Ukrainian diaspora representatives. And I asked them about diaspora responses to the Euromaidan uprising. And lastly, I look at post-Euromaidan discourses on the national level, on the Ukrainian level, on migration and diaspora. So before I proceed with the contemporary Ukrainian context, it's important also to give some socio-political background on how the discourse of defectors came into being during the Soviet time. Soviet migration policies were extremely overwhelmingly restrictive and repressive. And from the Soviet point of view, all those who left the country were traitors, and all those who came to the country qualified as spies. And the Soviet regime gradually imposed effective ban on immigration and even foreign travel, so that the right to cross the Soviet frontier soon became a rare political privilege. If you could look at this wonderful poster, here it's a Soviet time poster saying the enemy will not pass. The borders of the homeland are guarded by the entire Soviet people. So tell us already a lot about the whole discourse on immigrants. As it well documented under 1935 legislation, the death penalty was applied for the people that were illegally living in USSR. Later on, next slide, please. Later on in 1955, after Stalin's death, this death penalty was withdrawn. However, a tough restriction on immigration lasted until 1990s. Citizens of the Soviet Union had to obtain exit visas, and the picture of this exit visa you could see on the right side of the slide. This is Soviet exit visa of second kind, and people had to pay a lot to obtain this exit visa. And those who tried to escape the USSR and did not succeed were branded as traitors and fired from their jobs. Next slide, please. So, as it very well known and documented, every contact with foreigners was watched, and contacts with foreigners were related to espionage. And I found a wonderful manual, KGB guide, on how to detect a foreign spy. And I give you a quote here. It's what actually was extremely flattering, the image of the appearance of the foreign spy. So spy's appearance, always neat, tidy, shows the qualities of a cultured, unusually polite, respectful person, traits that are not always inherent in our average work. He is helpful and polite, especially to women. He stands up if a woman enters the room, takes off his hat with greeting, and rarely shakes hand. And there are many more points where you could identify a foreign agent, and I would skip. It's just like a teaser that you could find them more later. So, yes, next, yes. So as you could see that the whole origination of this extremely negative discourse in Ukraine comes from the Soviet times, and we see that the perceptions of immigrants in the independent Ukraine were mostly negative. I created here a word cloud. If you have a look on the right side, you could see the main associations with the migrants, immigrants from Ukraine. One could find in national discourse, brain drain, shame, problems, defectors, trainers, prostitutes, alcoholism, drug, HIV. So mostly negative discourse prevailed. Immigrants were branded as traitors of nation, unpatriotic for not staying to help buildings in Ukraine. Ukrainian women abroad were branded as prostitutes. Even our president Kuchma once in his interview to Italian newspaper said that Ukrainian women in Italy, they are prostitutes because they don't want to work in Ukraine. And also women were blamed for degradation of family and orphan children and men's alcoholism. And in terms of labor migration, the perception was also negative, equally negative. And for instance, one of our politician, leader of Communist Party, he said that labor migration contributes to the spread of alcoholism, drug use, and HIV in Ukraine. And in academic discourse, it was representation of migration was more as a national security threat. Next slide. So if we will look at the perception of the Ukrainian diaspora, here the representation of the Ukrainian diaspora in national mass media discourse after 1991 was almost absent first, and then in the interviews I conducted, there were different images, and one of them was that Ukrainian diaspora is mostly perceived as unwelcome, naive outsiders in vyshyvankas, in Ukrainian national clothes, who felt that they knew better than those back home. They want to teach us, and arguments like this. Another image was of Ukrainian diaspora. This is the union of the millionaires and the billionaires club, someone said. And there's also a cash cow, much needed foreign currency. So there were also these sorts of perceptions, but not as negative as towards migrants. Next slide, please. And what now, later in my book, I described the events of 2013, 2014, the Euromaidan revolution, and the conflicts triggered by the Euromaidan revolution, political, economical crisis, annexation of Crimea, the war. And I argue that migrants and diaspora's extensive engagement in the Euromaidan uprising and the defense of the country was the trigger which contributed to changing this negative image of migrants and the diaspora for the better. So I found that there was a fundamental shift in the perceptions of migrants and the diaspora, Ukrainian diaspora. And one could see more and more titles like this. Ukrainians abroad are the biggest investors in the Ukrainian economy. And indeed, remittances in 2020 to Ukraine reached $12.1 billion. Then migrants are not traitors, but our asset. And the main asset of Ukraine for 30 years is labor migrants. So there was rebranding of this image of Ukrainian migrants. And we could clearly see also in the speeches and politics of our President Zelensky and also politicians, that the role of diaspora is more and more appreciated and emphasized. And Zelensky said that now we are 65 million, which this number includes also diasporas. And due to different factors, complex of different factors and crises, Euromaidan, we could clearly see that perception, this negative perception, has shifted to a more positive one. And next slide, please. Yeah, I would stop here and looking forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Irina, for giving us the Ukrainian perspective. We would like to say also that we had some chapters on Ireland and Portugal, and we invite the leaders to speak to us and have a more bigger panel on and be able to do a comparative analysis, but unfortunately these people were not able to be here with us. And I would like to invite Maria to give us some points to discuss on our previous panelists, and then we will open the floor for questions.
Thanks a lot for me, and thanks also for the Greek diaspora project, which I've been almost at the very beginning. I remember Calypso, we were having early discussions with her, and then with Othon, and I'm really happy to see that this project is towards its end. It's not ended, I don't know what it is, but that this book is such a big success. And I have read it from beginning to the end, so apparently we cannot give all the comments that I really want to, but decided to actually focus on 3 points, which are about your elaboration on crisis and critical junctures, which I think is very important to think about when you come to diasporas and what this book really brings to that. The second is the north-north migration, which somehow transpired in the discussion of Manolis, and is very, very clearly seen in some of the chapters. And finally, something that built on what Othon mentioned, which is about the central governance, but also that will build also conversation. So I think that the book makes very good use of the idea of a critical juncture. I mean, theoretically, it starts with the idea that it's coming from historical institutionalism. It's like a very important period of rupture. And also, they think that it has this transformative potential with regard to diasporas and what we know from work earlier, which kind of like we have a nice conversation. For me, the important thing about this book, about how it builds, is that it really shows in the very many aspects of the empirical parts how this critical juncture really works in the Greek case. And I mean, Manolis talked about the big outflow of people and how it really politicized and it really created the necessity of in Greece. And I think that the voting chapter, for example, the chapter on philanthropy, even the one that is on social portability of social rights, is very clear. This rupture and the outflow of migrants creates new political dynamics so quickly that the state cannot cope with it anymore in the same sense that Othon mentioned, even that has outside some embassies and cannot really feed them. So in that sense, the state collapse is not a collapse state that we think in failed states and other literature, but the state is incapable of dealing with its own engagements, financially, administratively, in various ways, and then it opens these spaces in which new actors come. And I think this is what really becomes visible in the book about how the new actors become engaged in pursuing diaspora policy. Only the voting chapter, which I loved, was about showing about how a very non-traditional way of dealing with migrations are very much closed into its own bubble of now thinking about migration and voting as a possibility from abroad. Yes, you can vote, but you need to take your airplane and come to Greece. So very old-fashioned, how actually this crisis created the opportunity for that. So in the same time happens, I mean, in the close succession of things happens that the New Democracy, which has been the biggest party that was supporting the diaspora, is not anymore the major actor. Right? It is supported, but Syriza becomes important, so it actually starts competing externally on the turf of New Democracy. Then there is a case, a court case, which brings certain voting issues with the European Convention of Human Rights. Basically, states become pressured from all kinds of parts, and this is where the diaspora comes into perspective. And you could see this also in the philanthropy chapter, where it's very visible how a very important organization cannot cope with it, not simply because people are at different age groups, but because they do not have the incentive, because the state doesn't have the capacity anymore to support them, and their own self-motivation is missing. And you could see this also in the social portability chapter and in many others. So I think in that sense, the book has done a very good job to show how the inability of the state to cope with its own capacities, right, opens these spaces and the variety of others, not something. Louder? Okay, so I think that the critical juncture discussion is very rich. It has a lot of richness that one could see at the different actors that enter the picture, and this is not simply the diaspora. So the second thing is about the north-north migration. And when I read the book, that I've been invited here in the role of having studied, having published a book with Oxford on diaspora entrepreneurs in the invested states. So I have done a lot of the scholarship, which is about diasporas in crisis, mostly violent crisis, and then also with regard to the developing world. And most of the literature there is really geared towards thinking about how do we theorize social remittances. Peggy's very idea is that people are acquiring certain values in a Western country, and then they're transferring to the countries of origin. This means some gender rights, maybe corruption that is really taken by the book here, maybe about the. And eventually, the scholar of Latin America, she kind of changed the idea that also social remittances being flow differently the other way around. But I think that this book is showing how much it is not simply the financial remittances that are a very old pattern, right? During a big crisis that you would expect that everybody would be really pouring their money to the country. Actually, there is a big outflow. That is a very interesting phenomenon. Even people are getting money from the home country. But also about the social remittances, about issues of corruption. I think the corruption chapter is really very interesting as well. And they're saying like we experiencing corruption also in the UK, in Germany, in a very sophisticated way. So how are you expecting us to really have any implications of our, changes of mind into the country of origin? And in that sense, that kind of like sophistication about of understanding where the corruption in other countries that are host countries lies, I think is I haven't seen it anywhere else in the other literature. So I think that sensitivity about it's not only Greece, it's also here, and how do you expect us to change that? Which builds on a bigger theme, right? Which is very potent for our world today, and it is the theme of democratic backsliding. It's not simply about corruption, but similar arguments could be said about why is it the democracies are trying to promote democracy in autocratic states, and they are actually in a stage of retraction, and people see that. Right, and this becomes very, very visible, I think, from the corruption chapter and generally this north-north migration discussion. Irina's chapter is excellent about this. Very good job done the colleagues where they have done the survey and explained how the survey has been in very rich and there's a lot of data about the UK, but I mean, it's very deep and rich. So I would really suggest you to look into this. But exactly, it's not dynamic, it also triggers a lot of people who are very educated, and it doesn't have all the time these destitute people at home. That would be the case, let's say, of Haiti, or that be like the case of Tajikistan or others. GDP per capita of the country is not really carried by way of remittances, but the state still cannot cope. So it's like a lot of gray areas in which diaspora and migration enters the political picture. And in that sense, I also wanted to say the final points about polycentric governance. And here I have also like a personal preference for the idea of LGS, because the center that didn't mention that I'm affiliated with Germany had a whole group that was dealing with polycentric governance, and I was one of the scholars who looked into the issue of government and migration. So I think their idea, which is at the very end, right, this is not governed because the state stops pressure, the state weakens and kind of adapts to other actors, right? Whether they're diasporas, the big philanthropies, the ship owners, which I really like so Greek, right? The ship owners who become so kind of active in philanthropy, right? Because they pressure the state, but the state adapts, but the state is not any longer that and only actor. I think probably here somehow the European Union enters, not so much as the triggering element, but mostly about the funding that actually becomes married with the state, and the diaspora can really not penetrate, which I think is very interesting as a phenomenon, because institutions like education or financial or other ministries that usually would think, okay, they may be entrepreneurial, want diaspora money, they're very not interested because they're in some kind of specific relationship with European group, right? And this is where the European enters, the diaspora enters, the court case enters. So all these actors polycentrically, they are not simply pressuring the state, but they're governing migration from different perspectives that are much more fluid. And in this International Studies Review Forum that we published in 2021 from that group, and our paper in 2022, which reviewed international studies, actually talks about this regional dimension, where this polycentricity has very much different ways in which power is being exercised from these actors. If the Greek diaspora did not have that's kind of very strong, powerful philanthropy, maybe even this center may not have been in the space, right? I mean, think about Bulgarian diaspora, who I'm originally, who would be sponsoring something like that. In a certain sense, the Greek diaspora and the fact that it has this philanthropic function and for very many years being maintained, but really mobilized at the time, is really important. It's powerful actor, right? In many other places we have actors, but they're not powerful, they're disjunction. So, and final point is about your story and back to the crisis, right? I never enjoyed the story about the spy, but I think that the most interesting thing is how you were showing about how the Euromaidan actually changed this perception of the diaspora is not anymore the traitor, which does show how late actually Ukraine comes into the picture of all of these discussions, because, for example, Armenia and others have been much more open to various very many diaspora experiences because of historical relationships, but also because of this moving out of the Soviet mind. And I think that what we're seeing now, for example, with the diaspora that is mobilizing, it's a completely different type. And here the diaspora has become even more important because it has been engaged in taking arms and going to fight for the country, huge humanitarianism. So, I mean, that probably is going to be the future research in this field, right? In terms of how you govern. The question is this all governed also by the Ukrainian state? And my answer is, I don't think so. I mean, I didn't write it to OSCE or whatever, the place that they're trying to, as other actors, meet the picture and back to the polycentric government. So in that sense, congratulations for Irina. I have already assigned it to my students even before I invited. So it is on my list.
Thank you very much, Maria, for all the positive comments, especially for
the diasporic vote chapter that Othon and myself have written. And now I would like to open the floor to questions for people that are in our room. David, please.
Thank you very much, Foteini. Thank you for excellent presentations, very much including the one on Ukraine, the diaspora. But back to Greece. Presumably, the emergence of Greece from the crisis means that the position of the Greek state vis-a-vis the diasporas is strengthened. What will be the consequences of that?
Or Manolis, give.
Just to clarify, David, when you say strengthened, what do you mean?
I mean that whereas perhaps 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the diasporas were feeling, the Greek state not done very well. In fact, the common perception around the world is actually the Greek state has done well to pull itself out of the mess. So, presumably the diasporas were feeling rather good about that. But what are the consequences of the strengthened Greek state for their relationship with the diasporas?
I think, first of all, from a Greek state perspective, the diaspora is not a kind of quantity that is very well known. I mean, the Greek state is used to operate, or traditionally was used to operate in the particular sectors of diaspora in order to either deal with issues of foreign policy or, catering for culture and language. So these were the traditional kind of engagements of the Greek state. One thing, of course, that happened to the Greek state is that during the crisis, the Greek state lost complete legitimacy in the eyes of those abroad. And in that sense, it didn't manage to kind of bring that diasporic help that it was asking for. Now you're obviously asking me about the post-crisis and how the Greek state appears now in the context. There's been a big mobilization in terms of either bringing back those, brain drainers that left, or to try and work in the context of brain circulation or brain gain without having those, that left having to return. So there has been a conscious kind of approach to be able to engage with those. And as I said in my presentation, the new environment and the consecutive crisis after that did add to various areas of cooperation in other issues. For instance, during the pandemic, there has been a lot of engagement and interaction on issues that had to do with health, obviously. So there is a new understanding as to what a diaspora can really offer. I think that the crisis has helped in terms of, first of all, the state itself diminishing its own kind of role. An example is that with the institution that I mentioned, the Hellenes Abroad, there has been another law a couple of years ago where the contribution of the state financially was totally eradicated, and also it took a backseat in terms of how to recreate that kind of institution. So the state itself realizes as well its own kind of weakness in many ways, because with circumstances changing, it's very difficult to be able either to mobilize or to be able to manipulate sometimes the diaspora. These are where times are really, really changing. And you've got a different kind of notion of the state. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I just wanted to, mostly define what is the new nature of the state when it actually engages with diaspora in a country like Greece. And I'm sure that there are parallels there with other countries, like Italy or Portugal or Spain or Ireland.
I don't know if Manolis would like to add something to this point.
I'm sorry. That clearly the question. So someone from the panel has to repeat the question to me, because it was not clear. I couldn't hear clearly enough.
Anyway, we will come back to that because I've seen some other things. So please.
Thank you very much, Robert McCullough here. Thank you so much, all the panel, for couldn't cover everything, but what you did cover was splendid. I'd like to talk a little bit to ask you to talk about the financial side, because you hinted in your presentations that attitudes vary, and it wasn't quite clear whether attitudes diaspora, particularly when it comes to spending money, vary because of the time frame or the particular crisis or what. My comparator is that 20 years ago, I was involved in a study. The idea was to issue Polish diaspora a government bond, and bluntly to offer a slightly lower interest rate than was commercial, to appeal to people helping the reconstruction of Poland. And team of us went round, we talked to individuals, we talked to funds, in particular in the United States and Britain. And we found that the idea was a dead duck. The maximum loyalty you could possibly get was 25 basis points when interest rates were 7-8%. And when we did in-depth interviews, their attitudes were like, well, we got out of Poland, why do you expect us to subsidize those who stayed behind? That was many years ago. They were prepared to give to Polish charities, particularly in the United States. What they were not prepared to do was invest in Polish government bonds, which, by the way, were 100% guaranteed by the government. So what I'd like you to say a bit more about is whether attitudes vary, whether they are very dependent on the particular economic crisis, or what?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure if the question is connected, so we can just group it and.
That was my thought, because it's kind of connected, because it's about the financial inflows and outflows. And I think it would make sense to I'll be very interested to hear if there is an answer to think of these difficult questions. What I was intrigued at was the fact that remittances went down so much. So the money was flowing out rather than in, and that's very odd. So my first thought was, well, it's the prices. So the whole of Europe was in crisis, so there was no money to come back. And then I thought, I doubt if that was the case. I think it's much more likely, and this is my question. These were not really remittances, but the outflows were families not sending money to support the immigrants, but sending money to safer banks in host countries, because the diaspora could open bank accounts in safer places. So I'm just wondering, survey would have allowed you to disentangle that. Were these really small remittances? With these lots of Greeks taking advantage of having bank accounts in other places?
Thank you very much. I think Manolis will put answer Othon, because he has a chapter on remittances with another two colleagues, so he can share a bit of his wisdom on financial remittances.
Yes, I would like to thank you very much for both questions. And before delving into the issue of remittances, I would like to respond a little bit to the first question, and starting by the fact that migration is an act that facilitates in itself disengagement, or allows the people to disengage with the states with which they, earlier formed part of. So even though there is a lot of focus in the literature driven by policy related discussions and policy interest about diaspora engagement, we shouldn't lose sight to the fact that a large part of the migrants who leave the country wish to not engage, at least not with institutions, governmental bodies, or oftentimes even organizations and the professionals and they engage more in terms of like providing support to family members and friends, direct kin, and other people that form their close network back home, but not generally provide help to institutions or a state that they hold responsible for having created the reasons that led them to leave the country. So this comment and kind of example of Poland is quite interesting, and I think it's not unique, but it's quite typical, and we've seen it quite be similar reactions and reasonable reactions on part of Greeks who left the country, who really wished to express their disappointment in a way of not wanting to engage with the state. Now, when it comes to actual monetary remittances that may be captured with aggregate data that are available or through surveys like the one that we have done, as you have pointed rightly, we can't be sure in terms of the aggregate data because they do not capture all flows of money. The available aggregate data do show a reduction of remittances, which may have to do with lack of trust of official banking ways of transferring money during the peak of the crisis on part of the established diaspora that may have sending money before. But when it comes to recent migrants, what we found in our own survey is that a little bit more than 1/3 sent money back home, mostly to family members and mostly in order to repay a debt or for immediate health or consumption reasons. So 1/3 sending money back home, and some smaller share did receive money to support their immigration project. And the reason for this rather small amount of people sending back home has to do with the socio-demographic makeup of the immigrants. So approximately 1/3 of them, a little bit less than that, come from vulnerable socioeconomic families. And those were the ones who have been sending money back, in fact, irrespective of the socioeconomic situation abroad. So when your family back home is not in a good economic condition, that is in itself a very important, that provides a very important motivation for you to send money. And as we know from other cases of migration, and that has been indeed the case in Greece, and that explains the low, rather low number of people sending money, because there wasn't an immediate and acute need on part of the families and people back home. And the last point, and I conclude with that, has to do with, which relates to what Maria was saying about the case of Greece as a particular case through which to look on diaspora engagement being a north, speaking of a diaspora that was created from a north to north migration. And I would add to that, not only north to north migration, but one which has happened to a large extent as a result of migration within a context of legally unconstrained mobility, namely migration within the EU. And as a result, migration was for most people an individual choice to progress in life, and not so much a kind of a collective decision of a family to send 1-2 members abroad just to support as an extra source of income or to avoid risk or having an additional kind of source of income. And in that sense, the actual motivations that drove migration explain the demographic makeup of the migrants, and also explain the reduced flows of monetary remittance. But there are other remittances of other kinds. Should we name them social remittances? Otherwise, I'm not sure, but there is a willingness on part of some people, at least, to make contributions on other terms. And this has happened indeed already.
Thank you, Arno. Maybe I'll let it go the point, and then Maria.
Yeah, very briefly, something. I mean, financially, nobody was willing to help, the Greek state. The diaspora was at some point under discussion, but it just didn't fly. The Greek budget was seen as a bucket without a bottom. So, there wasn't any kind of, and when, they turned towards the Greek Americans, who are the most kind of more prosperous of the diasporic people, they were not willing. There was a church that was approached, but they were much more interested in building the church in New York that was destroyed during 9/11. The Orthodox Church itself, the Patriarchate was itself dependent on the Greek state, so there wasn't any kind of, willingness to do this simply because it just, knew that any money that was going to be spent was going to be completely lost. So, that was their crude reality. On the contrary, there was a lot of money that left Greece and went to banks abroad, as we also know, especially during the first years. The one that didn't go to the mattresses at home.
And your question about bonds, diaspora bonds are something that a lot of the development agencies are experimenting with right now. And apparently you have another experience, which is really interesting to talk about later. But the point is that I think something I think it was in the Irina's chapter was very, very interesting because the conclusions were saying Greeks abroad, according to the survey, they want to help the country of origin, but they do not want to help this financially. They want to do this with e-kind, with brain circulation, with other ways, right? In a certain sense, this is what, theoretically we think about it is that identity that maybe compels you so strongly, or some kind of other considerations. And here the considerations are more important. While India, just to do this because I'm teaching here today, to make sure that the country that India and Israel have done very serious diaspora bond programs and very well done because it's considered, especially with Israel, that the diaspora has a very moral, emotional attachment rather than the one that is much more aloof here, right? And in other works, for example, Ruby's spoken about here speaking this goes in earlier work that it's a much more aloof relationship, and here I think in the survey it's really unpacked with this dimension, which is identity versus more instrumental or other reasons.
Thanks, Maria. There's a lady that I saw hand before, so please.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on the book. I really look forward to reading it. One of the aspects of the north-north migration paradigm, apart from it being legally unconstrained, is also circulation. And I was wondering, Manolis showed us the figures of how many people leave and how it plateau. Is it at all matched by figures of people returning to Greece following the crisis? So, or is actually the Greece case study redefining our idea of north-north migration because of the potential lack of the circulation, which has been observed in other north-north migration paradigms? And my question to Irina, again, congratulations on this very interesting, but also I think capturing presentation of how the diaspora's engagement can change. And just to offer a potential hypothesis, I think up to the Euromaidan crisis, the emigration from Ukraine was very concentrated in the West. Yeah, I mean, it was a huge outflow of people, but it was very much concentrated in couple of oblasts in the West. While after the first Russian invasion in 2014, this migration and also internal displacement became an experience of a much larger group of people from the East, from the center as well. So maybe the change in how the diaspora's engagement is perceived has to do something with the relationship between experience and attitudes of the migration becoming much more, so let's say, democratic experience in Ukraine following the Euromaidan. Thank you.
First question, probably Manolis would tell us a bit more about circulation.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's a very good observation. And available data that we have coming from, like aggregate data that we have from Eurostat, showcase that return rates, at least for Greek migrants, have been low in recent years. Still, net migration is negative. And there is a kind of a modest increase recorded after 2014, but that, I think, is explained mostly by the concomitant increase of the actual population, rather than indicating a kind of a trend towards a kind of a reversal trend, I would say. In our survey, we asked about plans and aspirations. And in terms of, our survey was done back in 2019. And only 11% of the sample were planning to return within the next 3 years. An additional 14%, 1/4, would hope to do so. So they were aspiring to, but not actually planning to do so. They were not in a position to take concrete effects to that for a return. And in fact, it's interesting because we have done a follow-up research almost 2 years after the pandemic, and approximately 11% had returned, which is a number that matches what we have found in terms of the actual plans of people. It was not the exact same individuals who were planning to leave. However, as a number, it was the same share. And indeed, that's not a huge number, not indicating a reversal of trends. But you may not have circulation in terms of actual permanent returns, but what you do have is people moving back and forth much more frequently than they do in cases when borders are harder. And an example of that is even the pandemic, when a considerable number of people in our survey, we found that to be, I don't have the numbers in front of me now, but close to 20%, if I'm not mistaken, of people who spend a considerable period of time during the pandemic in Greece. Speaking of several months. And also we have done a research, we have analyzed some data from the Greek airport, and we have seen that many people are traveling very frequently. And so there is this de facto circulation and mobility, but not necessarily going together with hopes of permanent returns to Greece, at least not yet. 66% wishes to return at one point in the future without specifying when, and only if certain conditions are met. So interestingly enough, 1/3 doesn't want to return at all on the level.
Yes, for 2013, I would say that the migration patterns were slightly different, but I also will argue that the eastern part of Ukrainians, they had quite some migration experiences to Russia. So many of those who live in Kharkiv, Donetsk, Lugansk, they would go for migration to Russia. So western part of Ukraine, Vivska, Ternopilska, and other oblasts, they would rather prefer Spain, Italy, Portugal, Poland, of course. And it was extremely fascinating to find out why, for instance, Ukrainians were saying that Italy would be their country of destination, the favorite country of destination. We asked why in our survey, why Italy, then they would say that because it's a similar culture, it would be easier for us to solve some issues there. So it's a lot about some issues, meaning corruption, that they could use the practices that they are very well aware of in some other countries. So the choice of countries was a bit unexpected. Of course, the golden image was always for Germany. The Ukrainians always wanted to go to Germany, but the visa restrictions were tough and restrictive. But this interviews were extremely interesting when we asked why this country or the other. So the Western Ukrainians could still go Portugal, Spain, Italy, and of course Poland because of the language and geographic proximity. And indeed, after 2014, the whole migration picture has changed. So those Ukrainians from eastern part of Ukraine, they would prefer not to go to Russia, and the whole migration flows now directly to Western countries. Poland, of course, is number one, and now it's all very dynamic, as you might know. But it's really, I really appreciate your comment that migration becomes more democratic experience. And because I now do another project, I interview Ukrainian refugees in Germany, and I ask about their perceptions in Germany and their experiences. And they indeed talk a lot about social remittances, practices that they already transfer back to Ukraine, even via WhatsApp, Skype, and other sources. So it's indeed more democratic experiences, but unfortunately due to very dramatic events. Thank you, Irina. And I would like to make a comment on
I can ask you a follow-up question, Irina. I mean, we are seeing this massive wave of refugees from Ukraine, and from what I understand, in many of the neighboring countries, they do consider them that they are kind of temporary residents, and then going back. The reality, however, is that there's going to be a severe economic crisis in Ukraine and would not be able to cater, economically for those people to return. Is there any kind of thinking on this?
Yeah, indeed, those Ukrainians who are now in Europe, they got this temporal protection, which is 2-3 years, and those people I interviewed, when I asked about their plans, whether they would like to return, and of course it's a very difficult question for them, and they would say it will depend how the situation, how the war ends and how long the war continues, but many of them, they would like to return. But what was also interesting, that those Ukrainians who had already migration aspirations before the war, now they got a chance to implement their migration projects and they moved to Europe. And indeed, there would be, for Ukrainians, a huge challenge to accept, to receive Ukrainians back, but they would definitely come back with also new democratic values and with they actually, in terms of remittances, we see in contrast with Greece, we see increase of remittances in Ukraine, and even though it's not allowed, because those Ukrainians who receive benefits, they're not supposed to send some money back to Ukraine, but they find the way how to send this money and to contribute to their family members and to contribute to the economy of Ukraine. So, according to the World Bank, the growth in remittances for Ukraine in 2022, it's 8 or higher jump in remittances. Yeah, but in terms of diaspora engagement, because we have to distinguish here migrants, refugees, and diaspora, and their behavior to remit money is completely different. And also, there are 3 types of remittances: remittances to family members, remittances to the community, and I think that in terms of Ukrainians, it's similar with the Greek case, that there is a big distrust to the official institutions in the country, and they would rather relate to their community, to churches, to family members, than to institutions. So this is a similarity.
Thank you very much, Irina. And we'll take the last question. And Ellie, sorry, yes.
Sorry, it's me.
Yes, yes.
Okay, hi, I'm Bogdan Popes from Electron Politics. So there's been a lot to focus on. I'm going to echo the previous people who asked questions and praise you for really commendable work. I was interested in, so you focus a lot on people and the state in the originating country. I'm curious to learn more about what the recipient country is doing and what the public in the recipient country is doing as well. So thinking about, does the presence of diaspora, does that increase more bilateral relationships in terms of trade, in terms of cultural exchanges, bilateral affinity, financial exchanges, but also in many cases, we know about Brexit, we know about the huge rise in migrant politics, that the presence of diaspora, the presence of migrants is also conducive to more animosity and more hostility. So I wondered to what extent, what can you say about the recipient country, both in terms of the state, like the recipient state, but also the public and the people in the recipient country? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take this question as well. Again, congratulations on such a fascinating research project. And my question was because you have come across quite a broad range of empirical data. I was just wondering if you'd like to share one of your favorite discoveries, if you'd like, if there is a piece of empirical information that was particularly interesting or striking from all the exciting work that you have done. Thank you very much. So, maybe I'll Irina first. Yes.
Yeah, I've done quite some empirics, and I think one of the striking moments was when I talked to the diaspora representatives in the UK and also in Poland, and I talked to all diaspora, which is the national minority of Ukrainians in Poland, and I talked to the new diaspora. And for me, striking was that all of them, they felt like they are two parallel words, the Ukrainian diaspora and the state. So they really don't feel appreciated enough because the contribution of Ukrainian diaspora is really huge, and they feel underappreciated. They say that we don't expect anything from the Ukrainian state. We don't need anything. So there is a big issue here. There is no any connection and trust, and there is a big disappointment actually. So that was striking that both, I remember that we are moving like two parallel words. So they don't see that there is on in terms of collaboration and working together. And yeah, in my other project, when we asked about migration aspirations and images and perceptions of Europe, first that was the what I already shared today about Italy, why Ukrainians wanted to go to Italy, and then also there was one striking finding for me in the UK when I interviewed irregular migrants, undocumented Ukrainian migrants, and they also said, they also showed their involvement in Ukrainian matters, its financial and protest and all the rest. So all different levels of migrants have been involved and are involved. It's not only those who have good jobs, it's also undocumented for like not good money, but they want to contribute and they want to be engaged. And I haven't seen disengagement here.
Yes, I wanted actually to ask Irina to respond first because I wanted to think as what are some interesting and unexpected kind of findings. The first one is about the vote that Foteini and I worked in terms of tracing the whole evolution of discussions in the parliament, in the media, how that became really a very big issue in 2018. Started first by the party of Syriza. Now, that party actually is not traditionally linked to diasporas, but it did start the conversation because New Democracy from the right wing considers that diaspora is their kind of clientele, first of all, because they're more nationalistic, and secondly, because the technocrats that left also feel that New Democracy was much better equipped in terms of the market kind of reforms and all that they need in order to return the country. So New Democracy does feel that this is a natural space for it. Now, the vote is something that finally was, agreed, but there were so many restrictions at the same time that they made it, still it's a very difficult thing. What is an interesting observation from this is that there are very few people that have actually registered since that law was adopted, and they were, they had the freedom to register. So that says something about, sometimes we think that this is kind of a big issue, and then, there is very little interest. The second observation is that there is very, very little knowledge from the perspective of the homeland and the state regarding who is who abroad. I mean, there are the numbers, and probably the Irish are even more exaggerated in terms of believing that it's a country with a population of 60 million abroad. I've heard that number, and it's in the chapter that we have on Ireland. In the Greek case, some would say, it's around 8 million or something, but it's very little is known actually as to who they are, what they're doing, and that's why it's a very, very fuzzy picture. And my third observation has to do with the issue of corruption that Maria mentioned, in the sense that, you kind of expect that these people who live in the West for so many kind of years and decades, and then they go back with different habits and all that. Now, from my observation, personal, I knew that when you go back to the, to the Greek environment, you start behaving, like you're in a Greek environment. So, for instance, a very simple example is that when you're here, you drive in a different way than you do. It's okay, but you do drive here, in the way that you are expected to do. So that kind of adjustment here and adjustment there is another interesting thing, I believe, and that is a similar thing with corruption, in the sense that, you expect that they have kind of better practices to learn while they're abroad, but when returning, actually, either the system kind of absorbs you, or you say, there's no point in me trying to change, and often people feel, who are there, that you're a little bit out there, and you tell them, you're corrupt here, and me coming from the UK, I'm not going to behave there. So that's something else that doesn't work. That is about social remittances, which is a very important kind of theme in the way that we understand the impact of diaspora homeland.
And a question for you on that one about the non-interest in registering. And when I was reading your book, I was like, who is going to register if they need to have lived for a total of 2 years in Greece during the past 35 years to have submitted a tax return to the Greek authorities during the election year or the preceding one? So, I mean, who is going to, if they live for so many years abroad, in order to vote, go there and dispose all of the properties, money, etc., so the state knows how much to tax them later. But I mean, because in Bulgarian elections on and discussions on and off comes like, oh yeah, we need to tax the diaspora, and usually somebody in parliament tells them this is not doable. But apparently, because that's a very interesting finding, I was like, I can't believe I'm reading this, right? So that was maybe the answer for maybe one part. I don't know, I just want to hear you.
Yeah, this outcome of putting so many restrictions was due to the fact that you had to accommodate all these different party positions on this. So while you have New Democracy being particularly prominent in terms of supporting as less conditions as possible, again, as I said, it's a physical kind of electorate there. The other parties were, much less willing. So that was, while that vote was actually voted by 281, 85 out of 300, so it was a massive kind of vote in favor. There was so much, on the nitty-gritty and the conditions that obviously makes the life very difficult of those who want to register if they have to go, for instance, to the consulate in Scotland, or come here in the consulate in London in order to be able to vote. So that shows you how the reality actually really grounds, and it definitely explains why such limited registration.
Thank you very much. And friend, this is the end of our panel. Thank you very much for joining us, you in the room and all of you online. Thank you, Manolis from Athens. And please all join us for the reception upstairs.